afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual learning series. The topic of how to keep you safe on the internet. I know that young people throughout the country are spending more and more time online as we went into lockdown during the pandemic. And so trying to create strategies to keep them safe in what has become a very aggressive medium is very important. We're very lucky today to have Genevieve Dunn, who is our Compliance and Risk Management Officer, to lead and facilitate the discussion and to provide information for us. Genevieve, I'm going to just turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. So I want to start today with a shocking but significant statistic. Every 98 seconds, an individual in America is sexually assaulted. By the time we finish this presentation, that adds up to over 30 people. Why are we talking about this now? Well, one reason is that April is National Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which aims to raise awareness about sexual violence as well as educate people in communities so we can work together to prevent it. Why specifically is Second Story participating? This topic is highly relevant to our mission to support youth and families. Young people are especially susceptible to sexual abuse. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. Even in adulthood, the younger you are, the more you're at risk. For example, 80% of women who've been sexually assaulted report their first rape occurred before age 25. Of course, sexual violence goes beyond rape and sexual abuse. It may surprise you to learn that it doesn't even have to be in person. Virtual sexual violence is part of a growing trend of online hate and harassment as we see young people becoming more and more dependent on technology. For example, when we look at youth ages 8 to 12 years old, 41% now have their own smartphone, and they spend an average of 4 hours and 44 minutes per day on a screen. And note here that this study does not include any academic or work-related screen time, so this is purely social and recreational. Now, when we look at youth ages 12 to 17 years old, now we see 84% with personal smartphones, and they spend a whopping 7 hours and 22 minutes per day looking at screens. And another note for this study, it was conducted in 2019, pre-pandemic, so it's reasonable to assume these numbers have risen significantly since then. A common form of online sexual harassment comes in the form of cyberbullying, which is defined as repeatedly, intentionally harming somebody using electronic means. And of course, we just talked about smartphones, but there are many other forms of screens as well, obviously computers, but less obviously for most adults. Online gaming platforms is a big one. These are increasingly popular with youth, and we're going to talk about that later. Now, studies vary, but up to 70% of teens report being cyberbullied. And an even greater number, 95%, say they've witnessed cyberbullying happen and saw nobody do anything about it. It's normalized these days. Online hate and harassment is viewed as just an inherent, inevitable part of the internet. But it doesn't just stay on the internet. Sometimes older generations who've maybe only experienced in-person bullying suggest what seems like a simple solution. Just turn off your phone. Because if you're not online, you can't be bullied online, right? It seems like solid logic at first, but it's overly simplistic. For example, 83% of teens report their cyberbullying experience crossed over into in-person bullying. 25% said they were threatened with physical or sexual violence as part of being cyberbullied, and 8% said it really did lead to being physically and or sexually attacked in person. So you have to remember, these are real world people behind each screen. Even when it happens online, bullying has real world effects. Specifically, what are some of these real world effects? Well, we can look at this chart here, and we can see that mental health issues are a big one. Sometimes we see the development of diagnosable disorders, such as depression, social anxiety, eating disorders, but we also often see suicidal thoughts and attempts, low self-esteem, and ongoing feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. We also see school problems, right? So skipping class is on here, but we also see declining grades, loss of interest in extracurriculars like participation in sports and clubs. And I think this in particular is a perfect example of how these effects can be long-term, right? Very long-lasting, because what happens at the end of high school when you want to get a job or maybe go to college, but your high school experience, your performance was hampered just because you were victimized. Your bullies still go on to those things, but you don't. We also see a lot of behavioral changes, whether that's eating less or more, sleeping less or more. We see self-destructive behavior like self-harm and substance abuse. We also see changed patterns of socialization, things like deleting your social media profiles, stopping using social media altogether. These are on here, and they may seem like good ways to address cyberbullying, but keep in mind that especially now because of COVID-19, socialization almost exclusively happens online these days. In fact, it was in 2018, that was the first year that texting officially became teens' preferred method of communication. And that divide has only strengthened since then. So when a teen is forced to stop using social media, they're also cutting themselves off from any positive benefits of social support. What does cyberbullying look like? Here are some examples of it, as well as the percentages of teens who've experienced it. And we also have social media icons here that represent platforms over which cyberbullying commonly happens. Adults are often familiar with some of these, like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, but some are much more familiar to teens specifically, like Snapchat, TikTok, Reddit, Kik, Tumblr, and so on. Something that cyberbullying often incorporates is hate speech, which you can see on this page. And here's the definition. It's a type of verbal abuse that expresses intense prejudice against a particular group and/or threatens violence against them. A place that we see this a lot is within online gaming. And I think Lauren has a poll that she can launch, because I want to go ahead and touch base about how many of you participate in online gaming.
You should be able to see the poll on your screen now. Do we see the poll, or is it not showing up?
Yep, it's showing up.
Oh, great.
So I'm looking at the results here. We don't have a lot of online gamers. We've got a couple, but this is why we're going over this today, because unless you're familiar with these platforms, you're not going to be as effective at mitigating damage from it. So these days, about 3/4 of teens are either participating in or viewing some sort of online gaming. Some popular examples you can see here: Fortnite, League of Legends, Call of Duty, Minecraft, Grand Theft Auto. The majority of online games include some sort of community element these days, usually some kind of chat for people within the same game. Often this includes a spoken component, such as voice chat, but it may be solely text-based. Either way, these community elements turn online gaming essentially into social media platforms, and therefore we start to see a lot of the same problems. For example, 53% of gaming players reported experiencing harassment targeted at a specific aspect of their identity. For example, we can see here, sex, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and religion are common reasons to be harassed online. And this harassment exists on a spectrum of severity. Almost 80% of players have experienced some kind of harassment. Over 60% label that harassment as severe. Almost 40% report it contains sexual and/or physical threats. And about 1/4 of players have been doxxed in some way. If you're not familiar with this term, it's when private information about you gets posted on the internet. For example, your real name, phone number, your address potentially. And I think, again, this is a poignant example of how online harassment has real world effects, because suddenly we're not just talking about cyberbullying, words on a screen or from a microphone. We're talking about the possibility of someone showing up at your house, committing some sort of violence against you, your children, your pets, your property. Another major concern when it comes to online gaming recently is the exposure to extremism. For example, a whopping 23% of players have been exposed to white supremacist ideology while gaming. 8% have been exposed to ISIS propaganda. Online gaming, just like any other online arena, is a major tool used by people who are looking to radicalize youth. Now, what do I mean when I say radicalizing youth? I'm talking about criminal radicalization, the process by which an individual comes to adopt increasingly radical views about something. We often think of this in regards to international terrorism, such as ISIS, and that is indeed a real concern. But there are other types of extremist groups as well. For example, recently, we're seeing an increase in domestic terrorist groups related to political beliefs, as well as racism and sexism. Per the FBI, criminal radicalization generally occurs in 4 stages. And I'll be using a person you probably have heard of named Dylan Roof as an example of this process. This first stage, pre-radicalization, is where youth are exposed to extremist material, such as while gaming online. Youth then start to interact with said material. Now, this may be out of curiosity, or it could be something more purposeful. Maybe they are deliberately trying to expand or reinterpret their belief system. It also could be someone who feels disconnected from society, someone who wants to be accepted or feel like they belong somewhere. And honestly, that applies to most teenagers. In the case of Dylan Roof, his pre-radicalization occurred when he began to research Trayvon Martin's death and stumbled across a website operated by this white supremacist organization. Our second stage is identification, and this is when the youth begins to accept the cause. Now, some youth are already inherently more vulnerable than others. The pandemic has definitely increased everyone's vulnerability because it's increased risk factors for radicalization, such as poverty, unemployment, household stress, poor mental health, loss of social and community networks, and more. These all enhance the potential for online exploitation in general. And this stage is when you're going to start to see a change in the youth's lifestyle. They'll become increasingly isolated from their previous life, and they're going to start to take on a new identity, maybe with new clothes, tattoos, increased use of hate speech, posting violent or symbolic imagery on social media. Dylan Roof, for example, began posting photographs like this one with guns and the Confederate flag. He also began expressing himself a little bit more subtly, such as in this photograph. Now, does anybody see anything explicitly racist about this? What if we zoom in? And when we do that, we see 2 countries' flags. One is for Rhodesia, which was an incredibly racist country with a racial caste system. The other is a former South African flag from apartheid. These are relatively common white supremacist symbols, and you might be thinking, how are you supposed to know that? Are you supposed to memorize all of the extremist symbols? Definitely not. But if you were his parent, another relative, a teacher, a counselor, even a friend, you could ask him, what are these flags that you're suddenly put on your jacket? What do they stand for? Why do you have them there? And you can start doing some research on your own, because what we see is that intervening becomes more and more difficult the further along the youth gets in the radicalization process. Now, in our third stage here, indoctrination, the youth is immersed into the extremist group and becomes an active participant in group activity. This, for example, is when Dylan Roof created his racist website called The Last Rhodesian. In this stage, the new identity is strengthened, and it often persuades the youth that action is required in order to support the cause. And that leads us to our final stage, the action stage, where youth knowingly engages in extremist activity. And to be clear, they don't need to directly, violently participate. They may take on a support role, like sending money, helping to plan events, helping to recruit members. But some do, of course, go on to commit violent acts. I think most of us are familiar with what happened on June 17th, 2015, which is when Dylan entered a church and murdered 9 African-American people in hopes of inciting, by his words, a race war. And you can see this was a direct result of his engagement in both being radicalized and radicalizing himself. Again, we see how online hate leads to real, significant world consequences. Now, another type of online harassment that's also growing in popularity is what's known as sextortion. This is a form of blackmail in which sexual content is used to extort the victim and/or harass them. For example, we see Jenna, a girl who sends the boy she's interested in a nude photograph of herself. The boy says that unless she sends him more, he'll send the first nude photo to all of her friends and family. Jenna's now stuck. Obviously, sending more nude images only gives the blackmailer more material to blackmail her with, but the alternative is what? Admitting to her parents that she sent a nude photo? Not doing anything and risking being completely embarrassed? Most likely, Jenna's going to feel she has no choice but to go along with the blackmailer. So we see Jenna continues to send nude photos, continues to get blackmailed, and gets trapped in a vicious cycle where it may seem there's no way out other than suicide. We saw this process take place with a girl named Amanda Todd, whose name you may or may not already know. She was in 7th grade when she was groomed by an older man who persuaded her to bare her breasts for him via video chat. Unknown to her, he captured an image of this and used it to blackmail her into giving him more sexual content, or else he said he would release the image to her family and friends. Ultimately, he did that anyway, which led to Amanda being severely bullied in person and online, causing her to develop mental health issues such as depression. She had to switch schools several times, and she began to self-harm, which eventually led to a suicide attempt, which luckily she survived. Now, these images are from a video she posted telling her story on YouTube in September 2012. Her video ended with an image reading, "I have nobody, I need someone." She felt extremely alone as a direct result of being sextorted and bullied. Unfortunately, about 1 month after posting the video, she attempted suicide again. This time she succeeded and died at age 15. Another version of sextortion is through what's called a phishing scam, which this video will explain.
You get one of these emails here on your computer and it definitely gets your attention. It's a threat to expose some of your most intimate moments. Common sense will tell you that it's bogus, but then you can't help but wonder, what if? What if somehow a hacker activated your computer camera? What if that person somehow managed to record you looking at porn or activity in your bedroom or bathroom?
I have represented people in federal court who do amazing things with computers.
Legal expert Jim Todd thinks it's a long shot that a hacker could actually take control of your computer camera and activate the record. Such real cases are exceedingly rare. Still, the very idea is what drives this lucrative sextortion scam. The unsuspecting victim gets a message claiming malware was activated when someone visited a porn site. "I recorded your cam showing your immoral sexual doings." It goes on to say the malware downloaded all your contacts and "I'll email your recording to your contacts unless you pay me."
Now, as the video says at the beginning, common sense tells you, as adults, that these threats are most likely bogus. But people, especially youth, and especially youth who are exploring their sexuality, generally aren't going to think logically under pressure while fearing total social embarrassment and shame. So this is another place where education comes in, having these conversations with youth, letting them know these scams exist, these blackmailers are out there and what to do if it happens to them or to somebody they know. Now, the research shows that a large portion of sextortion scams and honestly other types of sexual cyber violence are committed against minors. And this is reflected when we look at recent sexual imagery data. I want you to take a look at this data I'm about to show you. So in 1998, we saw over 3,000 reports of child sexual abuse imagery. And you can see here, each of these red dots represents about 100 reports. A decade later, we saw yearly reports soar past 100,000. In 2014, that number surpassed 1 million for the first time. And last year, specifically in 2018, when this study was done, there were 18.4 million, which is more than 1/3 of the total ever reported. And this includes over 45 million images and videos flagged as child sexual abuse. And just to put this image in perspective, it's actually cropped because the number of red dots was too large for me to fit on the screen. So this is clearly a growing trend that we need to worry about, and we're seeing it in second story programs too. For example, here's a case study from one of our current staff members, Jessica Sorto.
Recently at our Teens in Crisis program, we had a youth that went through cyberbullying herself. In her case, she shared intimate pictures with close friends. These close friends then sent these pictures around to her peers without her consent. This led to her not trusting her peers. It led to an increase of aggression towards her peers because she lacked this trust. She didn't have close friends because of it. It impacted her support system to a point that she felt like she had no one. Loneliness can lead then to suicide or self-harm. Cyberbullying is a major issue. Only because it's online, it doesn't mean that it's not going to impact a youth harshly, because then it could also lead to in-person bullying, which she had been going through, and this led to a change in behavior that made her more aggressive.
What we're doing at Teens in Crisis to prevent this overlaps greatly with what we can do as a community in terms of prevention. The first piece of the puzzle is understandably awareness, hence things like today's presentation. Recently, with things like the Me Too movement, we are seeing greater public awareness on this topic of sexual violence, but I think we're still ignorant to a certain extent about just how prevalent it is. We're especially ignorant as to the many ways it can be perpetrated virtually. For example, earlier, we looked at how many of you participate in online gaming. It wasn't a lot. So how familiar are you personally with how to report death threats or rape threats your child might receive while playing Fortnite or Call of Duty? Probably not very. And that's where education comes in. Not just being aware of an issue, but being knowledgeable about it. Specifically, what we want to teach is internet safety. And there are so many great resources out there to educate yourself and youth. Here's just a sampling, and we will find a way to share these after the presentation. I think the most important thing to note here is that it's never too early, it's never too late to learn about this topic. Even adults can benefit, even if you think you know what you're doing, because adults, we do have a responsibility to model appropriate online behavior. And we have to keep in mind that technology is always evolving and youth often are ahead of us in this regard. But it is best to be preventative and start this education from a young age. We're seeing increasingly children as young as literally 1 year old or even younger getting access to screen time. The internet has already been an integral part of youth's lives. We focus a lot on keeping youth safe in real life, making sure they don't drown in the bath, walk into traffic, wander off at the mall. We can easily forget about this whole other world they exist in. And this PSA from the Department of Justice is a very poignant demonstration of this, I think.
Kev. Hey, Kev, what's going on?
In the digital world, kids can be anywhere. Know where they go. Visit www.knowwheretheygo.org to learn more.
So how can you know where they go? I really like this quote here. It says, giving your child uninterrupted access to the internet is no different than leaving them at home alone with the door unlocked. How many parents do you think lock the door when they leave their kids at home versus how many parents use parental controls? And the answer is actually only 39%, even though this is the best way to help youth stay safe online. And we have another poll here. What I want to know is how many of our participants know what a Vault app is?
Give me 1 second.
What's the question?
The question is, what is a Vault app? V-A-U-L-T. If you want to go ahead and say yes or no.
Do you see the poll or did it not launch?
The poll, I believe, is up.
Great.
So we're seeing a very similar percentage actually in regards to earlier, our online gaming. We've got a handful of you guys do know what it is, but most of us don't. And again, that makes sense, right? Without specifically seeking out this information, without knowing about it in the first place, that's normal. So if you are curious what a Vault app is, here's a screenshot of one. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I put the wrong picture in here. This is just a calculator. Or is it? A Vault app is an application designed to hide and protect data you don't want to be seen. Teens can use them to hide data from their parents specifically. As you see here, they can store pictures and videos, but also contacts, messages, even other apps. Almost always, they're going to require the creation of a PIN or a password to access the contents. Now, some Vault apps are designed to be hidden or secret, like this one is obviously designed to look like a calculator, and it even functions as a working calculator. But if you enter the PIN and hit the divide sign, it takes you into the storage section. Now, how can you find Vault apps? The easiest way is to prevent them from being downloaded in the first place. And this is where you would use parental controls to ensure that every app requires your permission to be downloaded and used. The next thing I want to talk about is protective factors. A protective factor is a characteristic that helps you deal more effectively with stressful events in your life. Because no matter how much awareness and education people have, unfortunately, online hate and harassment is still going to happen. One way of supporting the enhancement of protective factors would be by supporting services like Second Story that promote these protective factors, such as individual counseling to improve mental health, coping skills, family counseling to improve family engagement, financial assistance, access to resources to improve stability at home, and so on. But another more direct way is being a person that a youth can come to and talk to. We can look here. These are some reasons that youth don't report being the victim of online hate and harassment. And you can see that a lot of these have to do with other people's reactions. Everyone's going to overreact. I'm just going to worry people, as well as the shame here that it's too embarrassing. So here are some of the reactions specifically youth are worried about receiving. And you can see how saying any of these would make a youth feel like it is their fault. It's embarrassing. It's not a big deal. They should just suck it up and get over it. In contrast, what we want to do is encourage a climate of communication and then take action. This involves being open-minded, patient, and non-judgmental. Even if the youth did something that you think is wrong, right? And potentially sending that nude photograph, wait to deal with that, have that conversation as a separate conversation to reacting to the bullying or the online hate. Remember how much shame is involved in being a victim here. If you be that person a youth feels comfortable talking to, you might be the only person they open up to. Remember Amanda Todd's words, I have nobody, I need someone. You could literally save someone's life just by listening. And finally, what we want to do, although I know this is difficult these days, is encouraging a life beyond technology. Because when we look at online activities such as social media, these have been linked to higher levels of loneliness, envy, anxiety, depression, narcissism, decreased social skills. Over 60% of people report using social media and that it affects them in a negative way. So encouraging youth to socialize in person as well as online outside of the pandemic, promoting their interest in activities that occur offline, such as sports, clubs, hobbies, doing things as a family that don't involve technology. These may not prevent being the victim of online hate and harassment, but they can improve youth's resilience to being victimized. And sometimes that has to be enough. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this presentation was informative, and I'll go ahead and turn this over now back to Lauren and Jade.